Okay, now so far the the final piece is looking like this so far. I showed you these panels. Essentially, there are a few panels that are not finished and some things that are missing. This is what I worked on uh, for the next for the next this is this these are the panels that I essentially worked on. Uh, no, this is how the comics is looking up until the moment now what I was presenting. You and the next few improvements completely changed the way the comic was looking like. This is we're going to be essentially moving on to the way the final piece is actually looking like. I'll be explaining all the changes when I'll be explaining all the changes that happened between the previous version and this version. Okay, now the first thing you may notice is that the images look a little bit more detailed, but let's start in order. The first panel that I worked on was this panel of Charlie. This is the first panel where I actually went on to add shadows for it. The color that I picked for the shadows light was a purplish blue color. Yeah, this was the first panel where I added the shadows. You may notice that there is this light shadow. It's not the same color as the other part of the image, um, which is actually the shadow for the caretaker. Essentially, I decided to keep the shadow because it kind of shows that the caretaker is somehow in front of Charlie. What else? I also lit this image, and I added the shadows for where the parts of the image are not shown. For example, the parts of the image where it's under the Charlie's arms over here. I did not. I added shadow there, and also under his legs over here. What else? I also added slight shadows under his eyes over here. It may not be that much noticeable, but if you look over here, this is the normal color, and this is the darkened color of Charlie's eyes. One thing to note is that the way Charlie is lit in each scene is looking like this very like soft zigzag pattern. This is to show that this is he has fur. You may notice it right here and on the ears as well. Now moving on to the panel next to it, I did essentially the same thing. I added the shadows under his chin to show that he's looking down now. I also added the bowl. The bowl is now not blurred out as if it was falling down. I just added in so now that it's just sitting there as if it was just placed down. The next panel that I worked on was these two panels. By far, the most hardest panels in this entire piece is this panel and these two panels are by far the most hardest parts in the image in this entire final piece. The reason why is because, first of all of these background elements. But going by the order, I added the shadows for each part of the image. For example, I first improved the lighting over here so that it looks more correct. That's coming from here and not from the bottom part of the image. What else? And I also added the shadows where necessary, such as under his head over here, or maybe under his bottom. And I did the same thing for each image. Um, I added the shadows necessary to this right side of his, under the arms, on over here, as well as to Charlie, this side of the head. Um, an interesting comment that in order for me to get this shadows, all of those shadows correctly, um, I actually held up Charlie by myself in the dark room and lit him in the same way over here, and I essentially copied the way the shadows behave in that scenario. Essentially, I added all the shadows to each panel where necessary, like here, over here, and this side. The shadows were essentially final because I decided there would not be any other kind of light sources in the rooms. The next thing that I added was the textures and the small details for the background. You may notice that the wall scrapings are here, the wall's dirty, the floor is dirty, everything has these kind of small details. So where is this coming from? This is like a small backstory to me. I grew up in Kazakhstan, and most of my childhood I lived in these kind of like a little bit broken down apartments. They were not actually fully broken down, but it had these kind of like small holes every now and then, and these kind of holes remind me of the old apartments from the USSR that I used to live in. Um, of course, I exaggerated the amount of wall scrapings and how dirty the walls are. This was done for special effect. This was done for just an exaggeration. What else? As well as adding shadows to the characters, I also added shadows to the environment. The most evident shadow in here will be over here. The reason why I added shadow in this particular area is because the way this room is lit, all the lights are bouncing in on all of the walls. So essentially there are no areas in the room that will be like complete darkness, except for this area where it's hardly lit. There is actually there is a definite shadow over here. I also added shadows on the caretaker. So after I added these wall scrapings and dirt, I added it to all of the most of the backgrounds that I have in the comic. But I did not add them into these two panels specifically. That is because they were a little bit, when I added them, they were a little bit too distracting from Charlie. So I decided not to include them in this shot. And another change that I did was for this panel over here. It was initially was just like an empty image with just word soup 100%. But I decided to include the other parts of the caretaker's face, such as the top part of his head over here and the two eyes that he has over here. Okay, now moving on. Now to the panel 5. I've talked about the way I lit the two characters. Now I'm going to talk about all the small details in here. The wall scrapings, I also added the wall scrapings in here, but they're not perfectly repeated as in the first panel. Partially that is because they're not really that much of importance, and having them any different would not change the scene that much. Another thing that to mention is the shadows for the environment. What I did was I took the line work for the environment. I selected it, but I made the selection much thinner than the line work itself, so that I could add these subtle ambient occlusions. That is where the two surfaces touch each other and there is no light in between. It is the most evident in the counter over here. For example, this is shadow and this is shadow as well. What else? What I also added in was the small details on the cupboards themselves. You may notice here that there is this wood texture over here. I've hand drawn this wood texture by myself, so that it mimicked this kind of wood texture. I added that in because the cupboards in the other image look rather barren. They look very empty and they didn't have any kind of texture at all. But now they have a much interesting texture to look at. Another thing that I added was these handles over here for each cupboard visible. One thing that I also added for the cupboards is this specific cupboard that is a little bit broken. Now, the inspiration for this cupboard comes from my old grandmother's house, where this one cupboard was always broken. It was like hanging down like that. And I had to modify some lighting around it so that it matched, and I could add that in. What else? Another thing that I added was the tiling, the kitchen tiling for the wall of the kitchen. It's not the exact same tiling that I have in my house, but it's quite similar. It's actually quite consistent throughout each scene. That is the missing panels over here. The missing panels for the kitchen tile comes from the inspiration for when one of the washing rooms in my house, one of the tiles accidentally fell over and it revealed this interesting hole. This is where this is coming from. What else? So we end with this panel and we're moving on to this panel here. Essentially all the same wood textures, all the same kitchen tiles. And one thing to mention is that the only wall scrapping that is the most consistent is the biggest one. This biggest one is most consistent with the panels. You may notice it right here. What else? So I added all of the shadows, all the lightings, all of this stuff. The cupboards over here, the kitchen tiles, the shadows. And for the last panel, it was initially it looked like this. It was just two heads hugging each other, but then I just added a few parts such as the hand, the neck, the lights, all other stuff. What else? And this is how I got out to my final piece. I added all the small details, I added all of the shadows, the lights for each part. And that is it. That is how I got to my final piece.